When it comes to drug screening, timing is everything. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for session 2 of our 2-part webinar series, Building a Smarter Drug Screening Policy. In our first session, we tackled who to test. Today, we're diving into when to test, covering pre-employment testing, random testing, reasonable suspicion and post-accident testing, and how to stay compliant with state regulations. I'm Todd Schulberg, President of Medical Information Services at ClearStar, and it's great to have so many of you back with us, as well as those of you joining for the first time. Just like before, these sessions are short, focused, and packed with value. They're only 30 minutes, and yes, both of these sessions qualify for CEU credits, if that's something that you want or need. If questions come up during the session, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll tackle as many as we can before we wrap up. And once again, we're joined by the incomparable Bill Current. Bill runs the nation's leading drug screening compliance organization and is one of the most respected experts in the field. Simply put, we're learning from the best. Bill, let's dive in.
Well, thank you very much, Todd, and thank you, ClearStar, for this series of webinars on various aspects of drug testing. So important in today's, well, kind of crazy world of legal marijuana and other drugs that are emerging and coming on the scene and having an impact on the workplace. These are, as Todd mentioned, these are the topics that we're going to talk about today. Benefits of pre-employment testing, how random testing works, reasonable suspicion and post-accident testing. Then we'll talk about making sure your policy aligns with applicable laws in terms of the types of testing that you do. So let's launch into this by starting with pre-employment testing. Now, some years ago, I wrote a book called Why Drug Testing, and we updated it in 2020. One of the statistics that I used in that book was a reference to a survey that had been done of admitted drug users who were also full-time employees. And in that survey, 30% said they were less likely to work for a company that conducts pre-employment testing. So if you're conducting pre-employment testing, some percentage of applicants out there in the world won't even apply for a job with your company. And you may think, well, maybe I want those individuals working for me. I need to fill these positions. But you have to ask yourself, do we really want to hire people who are drug users who would prefer not to even work for you because you conduct drug testing? I've got some great statistics coming up on the cost of employing drug users. So 30% said they were less likely to work for a company that conducts pre-employment testing. So what is pre-employment testing? Well, it's a drug screen that is conducted before an individual is hired. It's usually made or conducted after conditional offer of employment's been made. So it's it can be one of the final steps before an individual is actually hired and put on the payroll. Now, depending on state laws, because this is not I can't make this general blanket statement, but it can be limited to applicants for certain occupations, especially safety sensitive jobs. That's pretty well accepted throughout the country. There are some state laws that allow employers to conduct random or certain types of tests in certain locations, but even if they choose not to do it in other locations. Now, if you fall under the DOT regulations, then applicants for DOT safety sensitive positions must pass a drug test, a DOT required drug test, before they can be hired to perform those DOT functions. So under the DOT regulations, you have to perform drug testing, and it has to include marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamine, and PCP, or phencyclidine. So pre-employment testing required under the DOT regulations may be required by some state laws, like states with a voluntary law that offers certain benefits to the employer, but you have to drug test a certain way. And in some of those states, it does require pre-employment testing. Now, how effective is pre-employment testing? So take a look at this chart. These come from one of the major laboratories that puts out a report every year on the results the positivity results from the types of tests that they do, the drugs that they test for, et cetera. And they break it down by what they call the federally mandated drug testing market and the general U.S. workforce. Now, federally mandated typically refers to DOT drug testing, and general would be anything outside of it. They also combine them, but I'm just going to show you these two. These come directly from their report. So on the top part in that graph there, you see across the line from pre-employment testing, you see the positivity rate every year for 2020, 21, 22, 23, 24. So for 5 years, and you can see it's been pretty consistently right around 2.5%. In 2024, it was 2.4%. This is the latest data available from this laboratory. That was for the DOT mandated or the federally mandated drug test that this laboratory conducted. For the general U.S. workforce, if you go down to that bottom chart, you see that for pre-employment testing in 2024, it was 5.1%. And that's generally been about the percentage, 5.2, 5.4, 5.5, 5.4, 5.1. It's generally averages out to a little over 5.1% over the last 5 years. Now, there's a big difference, right, between the positivity rate for federally mandated pre-employment tests and for general U.S. workforce pre-employment tests. In my opinion, and I checked with somebody who used to run the DOT drug testing program for the Department of Transportation and asked, why is that? And she said that it's because the DOT regulations have been in effect for so many years now that within that industry, the transportation industry, whether you're a driver, whether you're an airline pilot, whether you're operating a train, etc., they know they have to be drug tested to get a job. And you'll see in some of the other categories, the post-hire testing positivities, which I'm going to refer to in detail later, it's been in place. There's a deterrent impact that's already built into federally mandated drug testing. Whereas with the general U.S. workforce, it's a little bit higher because you can see that not every company conducts testing and not all employees or applicants for jobs know necessarily that they're going to be tested, et cetera. So the percentage is higher. That's a pretty big difference between 2.4 and 5.1%. But it does show you that consistency over the last 5 years does show you that drug testing works in terms of deterring individuals from applying for a job if they've got drugs in their system. Now, there was a study that came out last year that I found fascinating, which was substance abuse among unemployed individuals. Now, everybody that applies for a job is not necessarily unemployed at that time. We know that. But among people who are unemployed, the risk factor for substance misuse and substance abuse disorders, or substance use disorders, excuse me, SUDs, is higher than it would be for somebody who has a job. Perhaps because that individual with a job is subject to drug testing, the report doesn't say that. Perhaps that's part of the reason, right? But becoming unemployed and losing income can lead to psychosocial stress, which can lead to using substances. And in that last paragraph there, in particular, data shows that job loss was associated with a higher risk of alcohol-related health problems and the development of an alcohol use disorder, as well as illicit drug use and illicit drug dependence. So something to take into consideration when deciding whether or not to use pre-employment testing as a way to deter drug use in your workplace. Now, when we look at some numbers, I promised you I would show you some numbers here. Let's say, for example, you're a company with 1,000 employees and 15%, using the national average, are substance abusers. That means you have about 150 current drug users on your payroll. Now, this is just using national averages. If each one of them is costing you $8,800 per year, which is the national average based on a report out of the University of Chicago a couple of years ago, $8,800, then substance abuse is costing your company about $1.3 million a year. That's a big number, 1,000 employees. But what if we're talking about a company with 100 employees? Using the same percentages, 15%, that'd be 15 workers times $8,800 per each year. That's 132,000. That's a lot for a small company. If 500 employees is costing you 8,000, or 15% of 5,000, I should say, is costing you 8,800, That's $660,000 a year. In other words, whether you're a small company, a larger company, or we're just talking about 100 employees in one location of your company, or 500 employees in 2 or 3 locations, it's still a cost that there's a way to control, or there's a way to mitigate, and that's with drug testing. So pre-employment testing deters some of the drug users from even applying for a job with your company, and that helps you to avoid hiring a lot of drug users that tend to cost more money, right? $8,800 a year. Or we know that the substance abusing employees are 5 times more likely to file a workers' compensation claim. And an average worker compensation claim last year was $44,179. And if it was a motor vehicle crash related to a workers' comp claim, the average cost was $90,914. So you can see the cost can be extremely high. So keep your questions, put those in the question section. We can come back to any questions you have about pre-employment testing, but let's move on to random testing. Now, what's interesting about random testing is that it was part of that survey that I referred to earlier that I used in my book, Why Drug Testing. 40% of full-time admitted drug users said they were less likely to work for a company that conducted random testing. So again, even the very act of conducting drug testing, of having a drug testing program in your company, deters some drug users from even wanting to work for your company, which I consider to be a good thing. Now, what is random testing? This random testing is using an unpredictable selection process to identify individuals randomly who will be subject to a drug test. Now, there's lots of benefits. They're right there on the screen. I've got some statistics coming up here in a second, but I'm guessing, I've been in the drug testing industry for about 36 years now. Yeah, 36 years. And back in the 90s, the Navy came out with a report on its drug testing program. It was a very interesting report because the Navy was one of the very first employers, if you will, to implement a comprehensive drug testing program that included, among other things, random drug testing. And it was interesting because they determined what the most effective random frequency rate was. The frequency rate is what percentage of your workforce will be subject to random selection for drug testing. Probably didn't say that very clearly. Let's say you have 100 employees and you're going to use a random frequency rate of 20%. It doesn't mean that 20% of your workers, 20 different workers are going to be selected. It just means that you're going to do 20% of that number as random selections. And so one person could get selected more than once. I've had that happen, right? So the most effective random frequency rate was 20% according to this Navy study. It was also interesting to note, and I didn't make a slide on this, but in that same Navy report, 27% of sailors who participated in the survey said that they would return to using drugs if the Navy discontinued its random drug testing program. So it's definitely a deterrent for the drug user. Now, I bring all of this up because the Department of Transportation, which accounts for many millions of drug tests that are required by employers in the transportation industry, requires random testing. Those DOT, drug and alcohol testing regulations, require random testing in all of the different transportation modes that you see in that chart on the right there: aviation, federal motor carrier, railroad, transit, pipeline and hazardous materials, as well as the Coast Guard, which is technically not part of DOT. It comes under the Department of Homeland Security. So random testing is required by these various federal agencies. But what's the frequency rate? Well, it varies depending on the agency. So if you're required to do drug testing by a DOT agency, whether it's, say, Federal Motor Carrier or Federal Aviation, you're familiar with these random rates, right? You know that under the FMCSA, it's 50% for drug testing and 10% for alcohol testing. If you're covered under aviation, you probably know it's 25% for drug testing and 10% for aviation. And you can see all the other ones that are there. Railroad gets a little bit complicated, but the others are fairly straightforward. And pipeline doesn't actually require random alcohol testing. But these are the random rates that fall under the DOT regulations. Again, if you're covered under the DOT regulations, you know about these, okay? What's the positivity rate? If we go back to that chart that I showed earlier, making the distinction between federally mandated drug test results and general US workforce drug test results, and we just look at the line that says random, you can see that in the federally mandated market, the positivity rate is about 2%, and it's been that way for many years, and especially certainly for these 5 years that are shown in the chart, 1.9%, but right around 2%. If you go to the general US workforce, the percentage is higher, right? 6.3%. Part of that, again, is because of the expectation in the federally mandated market that you will be subject to random testing. And if you test positive in a DOT random test, you must be removed from performing DOT safety sensitive functions until you go through a return to duty process. Very complicated, would make a great subject for a separate webinar, but you have to go through that process before you could possibly be considered to perform DOT safety sensitive functions again. Whereas in the non-DOT drug testing world, that may not necessarily be the case, right? But the percentage is higher because the expectation of being tested may be lower than it is for DOT testing. Now, in the non-DOT random testing world, you've got a lot of options that are not dictated by the federal government, right? You can use a different random frequency rate. Maybe you don't want to do 50% for random drug testing. You can do lower. You could use that Navy report and say, I want to do 20%. You could do weighted randoms, right? That second bullet, if a person is selected, the system identifies that individual as being selected last time, and the person is less likely to be chosen the next time, even though he or she stays in the pool. You can change the kind of specimen that you want to use. Hair or oral fluid instead of urine, which is the method permitted by DOT at this time. And you can use separate random pools by location. Iowa has a drug testing law that allows employers to do random testing here, even if they don't want to do it in these other 3 locations or whatever the case may be. Very, very interesting there. And you can do that in many states. Now, best practices, if you're going to do random testing, which I think works for a lot of situations, maybe it's not for everybody, but you definitely want to educate your employees and your supervisors to make sure everybody understands how your random program works. And because these individuals are going to be in a pool for random selection, you want to make sure you keep that roster of people in the pool up to date on a regular basis, right? You don't want to be getting random selections for individuals who don't work for your company anymore and find out that 10 or 12% of your individuals who are working for you aren't even in the pool because you didn't update your roster. You want to make sure it's unpredictable, right? It's a non-predictable schedule, but you want it to be on a regular basis. I'm going to say it that way, but that's between you and ClearStar, for example. If you're using them, they can help set up a selection time frame so that you're doing it on sort of a regular basis, but your employees don't necessarily know when those selection times will take place, right? Review your policy and make sure it's up to date in every way. State drug testing laws change from time to time, okay? But make sure your policy is up to date. We'll talk about that in more detail in a second. And remember, DOT random rates are minimums. Even if you fall under the DOT regulations and you're required to do, say, 20% for FTA or 50% for FMCSA, those are minimums. You can do more if you choose to do that, even under the DOT regulations. Now let's move on to 2 testing methods that produce much higher positivity results, okay? For cause, sometimes referred to as reasonable suspicion, under the DOT regulations, are conducted when an individual who's been trained, and there's certification that the individual's been trained, and by the company is authorized to observe individuals' performance, look for or identify articulable signs of reasonable suspicion of drug use, and then, depending on your policy and which DOT mode you fall under, referring that individual for a for cause or reasonable suspicion test. Now, that's under the DOT regulations. Outside of the DOT regulations, you can you have a little bit of latitude, but strongly recommend that you look at all the laws from all the states that apply to you. If you're in multiple states, all of those individual state laws apply to you, and you need to modify or customize your policy to take that into consideration. But all states permit for-cause testing or reasonable suspicion testing. And when we look at the positivity rates for these two types of testing, you can see that even under DOT mandated testing, the percentage for cause is much higher than other scenarios for testing like pre-employment and random. And in the non-DOT, non-federally mandated market, you can see that it's a lot higher, 33%. And that's down a little bit from the last couple of years. But if you take all of the last 5 years, it's probably somewhere around 34, 35% as an average, but it's much higher in the non-DOT market. Now, just a few closing words about your policy. Make sure that it's up to date, that it's comprehensive, that it has individual addendums for the various states that you have business operations, so that, and if you're gonna test for marijuana, which most employers do, make sure that your policy also aligns with any legal marijuana laws that come into play in your company. There are a lot of different types of laws that affect drug-free workplace programs, from mandatory and voluntary laws like here in Florida, where Todd and I live, to mandatory laws in other states that apply to all employers that wish to do drug testing in those states. And then, as you can see at the bottom, I also included medical and recreational marijuana laws, because not all, but many of those legal marijuana laws do have language in there that affects drug testing. So know what those laws say and make sure your policy reflects that. The National Safety Council did a survey, and they found that 57% of employers perform drug testing, and that most, not all, but most of those companies include all employees in their drug testing pool. So that could be through random testing, through reasonable suspicion and post-accident testing, etc. But all employees are subject to testing. So that's a quick review of all the different types and scenarios of testing. But now Todd and I are happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Bill. We do have a few questions submitted, so we'll spend the next 5.5 minutes reviewing them and get everybody out in that 30-minute mark like we promised in the beginning. First off, Bill, can you still do drug testing if you don't do pre-employment drug testing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Now, again, you're gonna look at the state laws that apply to you to, be aware of any restrictions that may apply, or conditions, better put. But even if you don't do pre-employment testing, you can still do post-accident or reasonable suspicion testing. I will say that there was a report that came out 3-4 years ago that showed that companies that discontinued pre-employment testing typically had a much higher positivity rate when they did for-cause or post-accident testing. So keep that in mind. Pre-employment testing deters some of those drug users from even getting on the payroll. But if you don't do pre-employment testing, you may experience other problems and higher positivity rates.
Okay, let's see. If you do random drug screening, non-DOT, do you have to have everybody in your testing pool or selection pool?
Well, again, I'm gonna just remind you to check the state laws that apply to you, but generally, no. Most states will allow you to only do random testing of safety sensitive workers if you choose to. So let's say you got 100 employees and 50 of them are in safety sensitive positions. Some states define what a safety sensitive position is, most states don't, but be aware of that. But they do allow you to only perform random or only include those safety sensitive workers in your random testing program. So you can divvy it up that way. And as I mentioned, there are some states that allow you to do random testing in a specific location and not in other locations elsewhere in the state. So again, look at the state laws that apply to you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. On one of the slides, it said test while on company time required for DOT. Does this mean we must pay for employees to go to their random and DOT recertifications?
Well, DOT doesn't actually tell you what to pay for and what not to pay for, but DOT tests, and this applies to some state laws as well, do consider the testing time to be work time. And I don't know, Todd, do you have some clients with an example of that? I don't have a particular client with an example of that, but that's not uncommon.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, DOT companies, if it's through random or recertifications, it is on company time. They have to, they typically will notify someone of a DOT selection when they know that person can go right then, and that always ends up being on company time, in my experience. Like you said, Bill, I'm not sure it's mandated in law, in the regulations that state that, but I think it's more of a general accepted practice.
Yeah, I agree.
Another question, is there a difference between for-cause testing and post-accident testing?
Well, yeah, and I should have made that more clear when we were in that section. So for cause, sometimes referred to as reasonable suspicion, is when the employer suspects that an individual may be under the influence of drugs or alcohol while on the job. Whereas post-accident is a test that may or may not include suspicion of being under the influence, but it takes place after an accident. Now, let me clarify one point here. Again, I always refer to this sort of general statement, check the state laws that apply to you, because some states define what an accident is that can trigger a post-accident drug test. They may also define what reasonable suspicion is. And so you want to look at those laws very carefully. Sometimes though, and here's the point I'm getting at, sometimes there are some state laws that connect the two. In other words, you can do post-accident testing if you believe that the individual or individuals involved in the accident were under the influence at the time of the accident. It gets a little bit tricky there. And there's another area of law that you need to be aware of, again, as you're researching this or you're having ClearStar look this up for you, is look at the workers' comp laws in your state, not the discount laws like we have here in Florida, but the workers' comp denial laws that exist in many states where you can move to deny a workers' comp claim if you have a positive drug test, because in that state, by that regulation, it considers a positive drug test result as de facto proof of the individual being under the influence at the time of the accident. It doesn't necessarily say or mean that the drug test proves impairment, but for the purposes of moving to deny the workers' comp claim, it may include that kind of language. Keep in mind also, very interesting point, many of these state laws were written sometimes decades ago, and they haven't really updated some of the terminology. And so it may refer to impairment in a way that it's really not commonly accepted in the drug testing world these days. So be careful as you read those laws, but generally speaking, the difference between reasonable suspicion and post-accident is one involves the suspicion that the individual is under the influence, and the other one takes place after certain types of accidents occur.
And that was our last question. Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for attending this session as well as the one a few weeks ago. If you would like more information about ClearStar, you can find our web address and our email on the screen. Please reach out to us. And everybody else, have a great rest of your day. Thank you again for attending.